we use barn owls very effectively?
Hold on.
Where would that fall in this heading?
So, one other form of control that is sometimes talked about, but not included on the previous chart, is biocontrol. With biocontrol, we're talking about the use of natural predators to help control these pest populations. And probably owl boxes are the most common example of that. Essentially, the idea is you put up an owl box, you get owls to hopefully nest in that box, and then hopefully they will hunt in that area. Owls are very efficient predators of rodents. Studies show several hundred to even close to 1,000 rodents can be consumed by a pair of owls in 1 year. So that seems to make you think, oh, great, wonderful. The problem is, though, is that I've never seen a study yet that has shown that owl boxes will result in substantially lower rodent populations, even though they eat a large number of rodents. Nobody doubts that. The problem is they tend to eat them over a relatively large area. And these rodent species reproduce at a very high rate. Voles are perhaps the scariest of them. A vole is reproductively active after about 4 weeks. They can have a new litter every 4 to 5 weeks. So a female can have up to 11 litters per year in ideal situations. And she can have 4 or 5 young per litter. Now keep in mind, that first litter that she had, after a month, will be having her own young. And those will be having their own after another month. So one pair can result in over 1 million new voles easily in a year. Now, of course, survival isn't that high. I'm just providing an example of how quickly they can tend to overpopulate an area. And that's the problem with using natural predation to try to manage these populations, is that they can reproduce so rapidly that the natural predators oftentimes are not able to keep up with that population growth. So there's nothing wrong with having owl boxes out there. But typically what we say is that it's probably not going to be enough to manage that population. They'll pick off some rodents for you, and that's a benefit, but they're not going to be enough in most cases to manage that population for you.
Do they eat ground squirrels?
No.
Too big.
Well, no, it's different lifestyles, if you will. Owls are out at night. Ground squirrels are out during daytime. What you hear about with ground squirrels are raptor perches. Basically, people putting up artificial perches for hawks to sit on and hopefully predate on ground squirrels there as well. Once again, though, the data does not suggest that really works. In fact, there was a study up in Contra Costa County 2 or 3 years ago that looked at that and saw no appreciable effect whatsoever from placing raptor perches up there. So once again, it doesn't seem to be something that works all that well. Another one that I hear about sometimes is gopher snakes. I've actually had several questions of, well, what about if we release a bunch of gopher snakes? As the name would imply, gopher snakes do eat gophers and other rodents. But also, as the name implies, they are snakes. This means they're reptiles, and reptiles are cold-blooded. Cold-blooded individuals do not eat very often. In fact, a gopher snake only eats once every 3 or 4 weeks. So they are not eating very many gophers throughout the course of a year. So you'd have to have hundreds of thousands of gopher snakes running around a pretty small area to manage a rodent population. So once again, not probably a plausible solution, although it's still great to have gopher snakes around to help you out. The one example that I have listed here, though, that does seem to work to some extent is falconers. And probably it would be better to put this in a frightening device category, really, than a biocontrol category. Because essentially what happens is people will hire falconers to come in. They will fly the falcons over a set area, usually about 3 times a day, and that scares away birds. Falcons are very efficient predators of birds. Songbirds are deathly afraid of falcons. So this is in a backyard setting, but I just wanted to provide you an example of how something along the lines of natural predation can help, and falcons are a good example of this. They use it a lot in high-dollar crops like wine grapes and blueberries, reducing bird damage for 1 to 2 months. As you can imagine, it's pretty expensive to hire these folks to bring them in and fly the falcons several times a day. They have to fly several falcons throughout the course of the day. So it is a very expensive proposition, but does seem to work.
What will they scare crows?
Yeah.
Crows that are scaring my predator birds. It's the other way around, So, but will these guys?
Right. I've never seen it used for crows before, so I can't speak speak definitively on that, but you bring up a good point in that crows are pretty good at teaming up on a lot of these predatory birds. Yeah. So I suspect it probably wouldn't work as well. It's primarily used for starlings, house finches, some of those smaller species like that, and it does work quite well. Occasionally, the birds do habituate to the falcons, in which case then they let the falcon go kill one or two, and then that scares them again, and it works again. So
what's the antidote for crows?
nothing. Yeah. Each situation is a little bit different. Crows are very smart. Probably the smartest bird out there, at least in this part of the U.S. They habituate to things pretty rapidly. Certain kinds of frightening devices can work. Electronic distress calls from crows actually can be pretty effective, but there are limitations on where you can use those. And you don't want distress calls in your backyard where your neighbor's going to be hanging out. So that's problematic. Actually, effigies of crows can work. It's been shown in studies. If you hang a dead crow up, it scares other crows away. But there are limitations on where you would be able to use that. Lasers, to some extent, have been effective at deterring crows from roosting in certain trees. You have to be very persistent and diligent at it. The higher the beam of the laser, the better it works. But even, these kinds of laser pointers, to some extent, can work. Essentially what happens is birds, at least crows, I think birds in general, see these lasers in 3D. So they actually see the beam coming out as well as the end point. So it really freaks them out. But you have to do it repeatedly for sometimes months to scare them completely away from that roost site. So it's a very difficult proposition with crows. But there are a few things that you can at least try to help deter them. The best thing is if they haven't been there but now they start to move in, to deter them right away. If you deter them right away, they'll move on somewhere else. If they get used to hanging out in that area, then it becomes very difficult to tell them to go somewhere else.
Is it true that they're displacing or killing a lot of the native birds? Like the population has gotten so out of control of crows in San Diego that they're killing a lot of the other species of birds. Is that true?
I don't know.
You don't know?
No, I'm not that familiar with the local bird populations on that front. They are fairly aggressive. I suppose it's at least possible, but I don't know now. So, biocontrol is not necessarily one of the more effective options out there, but habitat modification is a good strategy for helping to manage certain pest populations. With habitat modification, essentially what we're doing is trying to alter the habitat to reduce the desirability of that area for a particular pest species. So essentially we're reducing the carrying capacity, if you will, for that particular species. Lots of different examples that we can include. Brush piles, pruning piles in your backyard, wood piles, things like that. Ground squirrels like to burrow underneath those structures. Getting rid of those helps remove some preferred burrowing sites for some of these animals. Same thing goes for rats. If you have rat problems and you have a trashy backyard, and I don't just mean piling trash, but I mean, wood piles on the ground, for example, are great places for rats to burrow, to create a nest in. Any kind of structure. If you got ivy hanging on your house, those are all great habitats for some of these species. And so removing those habitats are a great way to help reduce problems with these pest species. And it's usually the first step that somebody should think about when trying to figure out how they're going to manage these kinds of vertebrate issues. Maybe the best example, though, for habitat modification pertains to voles. Voles are very cover dependent. Without cover, they simply cannot exist in a particular area. So if you have problems with voles, if you keep vegetation load really low, that will greatly reduce your problems, in some cases completely solve them. If you have voles that are chewing newly planted trees or vines, I'd bet a fair amount of money that you have a lot of vegetation growing around the base of those trees or vines. If you either keep the vegetation mode really low or completely remove it for 2 or 3 feet around the base of that tree, for example, that will greatly reduce, if not completely solve, your problems with voles. So habitat modification is truly one of the best options we have for managing vole species. Exclusion. We've talked a little bit about exclusion today, but exclusion can be a good strategy for managing a variety of wildlife species. Raised flower beds are probably one of the first things that come to mind. These are a great way to exclude gophers and moles from certain areas. Essentially what these are, you got raised wooden slats to keep the gophers from crawling above ground and getting into these areas. Usually you have to have this kind of, some kind of an overhang or lip associated with that, because gophers do climb to some extent. They're not great climbers. But if it's just a straight piece of wood that's only 4 or 5 inches tall, a gopher can easily climb over that. So usually you need some kind of overhang to keep them from being able to crawl around that and into the excluded area. And then of course you need some exclusion underneath as well. Usually what we recommend is somewhere around the lines of 3/4 inch mesh. We call it gopher wire. Galvanized wire works best. Obviously, galvanized, it's not going to rust through as quickly. If you use standard chicken wire, it's going to rust through quite rapidly, and then you're just going to have to replace it. So it's worth the cost of going through and putting something that's going to last you for a little while, rather than something that's only going to last 1 or 2 years. But this can be a good way to keep gophers and moles out of certain areas. You can use wire baskets around newly planted trees to keep gophers from chewing on those root systems. That's another technique that's used to some extent. You usually have to be a little careful not to get too snug of a fit around the root system. You want to allow the root system room to grow. But that's something that can be used. Several different kinds of species can be fenced out of areas. This is an example of a rabbit-proof fence. With rabbit-proof fences, you're usually looking at something maybe around 4 foot tall. Particularly if we're dealing with jackrabbits, jackrabbits can jump pretty high. So it needs to be relatively tall. You also need to bury it a little bit, usually around 6 inches. Otherwise, the rabbits can dig underneath that and get around. When you're burying it, you also want to bend the bottom out about 6 inches, perpendicular away from the area you're trying to keep them out of. So let's say this is the area you want to keep rabbits out of. You got rabbits over here. You take this fence, you dig down a 6-inch trench, and then another 6 inches out, you would bend that wire. So that if the rabbit tries to dig down and around it, it's going to hit that lip, and that lip keeps it from being able to dig down and around it. So that's another modification you need to make for rabbit-proof fencing. But fencing is a great way to keep rabbits out of certain areas. You're only going to do that if you have a lot of rabbit pressure. You know, if you occasionally have one rabbit in your yard, it's pretty expensive to go through the fencing proposition. But if you have constant problems with rabbits, if you're next to a wildland area, this can be a strategy which you could use. There are deer-proof fences. There are a wide variety of deer-proof fences, but they all have one thing in common, that's they're very expensive, because deer can jump really high. So you either have to have a really tall fence, or you have to have some other kind of modification to it to keep them out. And there have literally been books written on